America, 1989. As the sun sets on a decade of unprecedented consumerism, the popular culture begins to weary of the polished and packaged rock and pop music that's been dominating the charts. High production values and crazy get-ups are out. Authenticity is in. And as the hungry eye of the music industry roves the land in search of profitable magic, its gaze descends on a port city in the Pacific Northwest, where a new sound is being born, a sound that will come to be known as grunge, and which is about to change the world. You have probably heard this setup before. By this point, it's up there with "Four young lads from Liverpool," or a gawky Minnesota kid arrives in the West Village with a guitar and a dream. In terms of iconic rock and roll tales, pretty much everybody knows the broad strokes of what happens next. Nirvana explodes, a feeding frenzy ensues, a lot of local bands get signed, some of them explode too. Then Kurt Cobain tragically dies, and the whole movement either peters out or else evolves into alt-rock. It's become one of the key rock and roll legends, and all the beats and all the characters are very well established in our cultural consciousness. But, as usual, the legend is not the whole story. Just ask Mudhoney. Welcome to Major Label Debut, the podcast about major label debuts. I'm Graham Wright, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Mark Arm and Steve Turner, founding members of Mudhoney, to talk about their 1992 album, Piece of Cake. When Mudhoney got together in 1988, all the members were already well established in the local scene. Bassist Matt Lukin had just left Melvins. Drummer Dan Peters was in Bundle of Hiss. Frontman Mark Arm and guitarist Steve Turner both played in Green River, whose only album, 1988's Rehab Doll, is often called the first grunge record. Green River, by the way, also included some of the guys who would go on to form Pearl Jam. It's that kind of story. Mudhoney's first record, the Superfuzz Big Muff EP, came out on the then up-and-coming indie label Sub Pop Records. Pretty soon the band was Sub Pop's flagship act, championed in the press by the likes of Sonic Youth and, yes, Kurt Cobain, who said the EP was one of his favorite records. They followed it up with 2 full-lengths, and then, it's 1992, grunge is exploding into the mainstream, financial turmoil is roiling Sub Pop, and major labels are descending on Seattle in search of the next big thing. It's time for Mudhoney to make their move. They sign a deal with Reprise Records and prepare to make their major label debut. Mark Arm, Steve Turner of Mudhoney, thank you so much for joining me today on Major Label Debut. How you doing?
Good, and I think so far it's a pleasure being here.
There's that thing that assholes do where they go to a restaurant and they put a pile of singles on the table, and then if the service is bad, they start taking them away, like that's the tip. You guys should each do that in your respective rooms, and I'll know how I'm doing based on it.
I've never heard of that trick.
I don't suggest it. It doesn't sound like a very humane way to behave to the wait staff, and I can't imagine it's that effective. At any rate, before we get to Piece of Cake and Mudhoney, I just wanted to say on a personal note, congratulations on sticking it out in the music business for this long.
It seems like a lot of us old, whatever you want to call us, indie rockers, punk rockers, we just kind of keep doing the same thing for a very long time because there's a lot of us out there.
Yeah, I just went to Girl Trouble's 40th anniversary show. Steve and I saw the very first show at a Battle of the Bands at Steilacoom Community College in 1984. Just learning how to play and just starting, and and they're an amazing band. They're always super fun, and they clearly don't give a shit.
Well, obviously part of sticking around, especially now in the podcast content economy, is, I'm sure you've noticed, getting asked a lot about your older stuff, doing retrospectives and album by album looks. I know some people like me love to talk about their past and their back catalog and relate the stories, and other people maybe a little less fond of looking back. What is your relationship with it like, Mark?
It's there. It's a part of us. There are things that I'm a little bit hazy about in the past.
Yeah, it comes with the territory,
That's exactly right. That's certainly the spirit that I try to enter into it with. I mean, you wrote a great book all about Mudhoney and about your life in rock, if I can put it that way. So you've recently done a healthy amount of looking back.
Yeah. And, there was also a Mudhoney book maybe 10, 12 years ago. I don't know. The first person I ever heard use the term legacy act was John Doe of X. And I guess that kind of applies to us at this point. But yeah, I love reading rock books and history books. The greatest insult that Mudhoney was ever given in my mind was some English journalist comparing us to Nirvana, called us harmless historians. And I love that. That's right up my alley there.
To be a harmless historian sounds like about as positive a contribution to humanity as any of us can hope to make.
Yes.
So we're here to look back and talk about Piece of Cake.
We're here to do more harm.
Yes.
That's our motto. Do more
harm. 21st century. This is where we're taking it. Well, from the age of more harm, going all the way back to October 1992, when Piece of Cake came out, the Seattle scene around that time has been relentlessly anthologized and discussed and recorded. But I wonder if you could sort of set the scene a bit for, maybe the younger listeners who haven't watched as many VH1 specials or much music here in Canada retrospectives. What was it like back in 91, 90, 92 around Seattle for you guys?
Well, we started in January of 1988, and the Seattle scene was very small at the time. We were all coming out of punk rock, basically. Pretty much all the major Seattle grunge bands could be linked back to a pretty small punk and post-punk scene in Seattle. And it wasn't a very big deal. We could play on Tuesday and Wednesday and then Thursday nights, I guess. We didn't get weekend shows or anything like that. Sub Pop kind of started getting more ambitious, and they got an office and they started putting out some more records, and we're seriously talking about piping up the Seattle bands and stuff, and we were one of them. It went amazingly well for us right off the bat, really, when we started, because Mark and I had been in Green River. Dan was in this cool band, Bundle of Hiss. So, we started touring. Sonic Youth backed us up, not backing us up, but they backed us. They gave their seal of approval to us. And we went to the UK, and things kind of exploded over there. Did a couple records on Sub Pop. And by 1991, we had put out Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge. And that did pretty well in Sub Pop's world, in the indie world. And then Nirvana and then Pearl Jam exploded. And then Seattle exploded. And then we did Piece of Cake on reprise. There.
Beautifully put, and I am certain you've answered questions about Seattle in the early 90s once or twice before, maybe. I can't imagine having Toronto in 2004 when I was starting out playing. I can't imagine having that be so encased in amber by culture. Is it ever tough to remember your real past when there's a whole industry devoted to mythologizing it?
Well, I think a lot of times when I'll talk about something that happened in the past, I'll just be remembering the last time I talked about it.
Yeah.
Instead of the actual event, And so things have shifted for us, and we'll have this story about the certain, I can't remember exactly what it meant, maybe the description of our band for the second or third time that we played Reading, and we're like, oh, they actually trashed us in the program. They didn't really.
No, they were just ambivalent about us, I think.
Yeah, it was but for us at the time, I believe it was a perceived slight.
Yeah, they certainly weren't hyping us up at that point. And
no,
1995 was the lowest year for grunge, if you will, because Kurt's death signaled the end, and it was a traumatic event for everybody, I think.
Certainly, and seismic throughout. It kind of instantly added that mythologizing element where it's now there's an obvious end point. There's a place where we can sort of all tie this bow off narratively. But I find that those stories, stories from the road, stories from life in a band, kind of happen when you're gigging a song for 15 years and then you go back and listen to the old recording and you realize that what you've been playing has evolved into something completely different. I don't know how often that happens to you guys, but I find the same thing with the interview answers and the classic stories and stuff.
Yeah, one of the things I did when I started on the book was I dug through all my old fanzines and enemies and melody makers and read old interviews with us. And it helped. I also read our chapter in Our Band Could Be Your Life and got myself back into that frame of mind a little bit,
Yeah.
And sometimes we were arrogant little pricks.
Sometimes.
You mean to tell me a young rock band had problems with arrogance? Now I've heard everything. I guess, speaking of the myth, speaking of the narrative, there's the story that comes out in my mind. The story that I always hear is that, everyone in Seattle is going about their business, playing in these cool bands, getting this scene going. And then one day Nevermind comes out, and the next day a golden airplane lands at SeaTac, and like 300 record executives appear in town with record contracts to hand out to everyone. I'm sure that's an oversimplification.
But that was happening kind of before Nevermind. That's how Nevermind actually happened.
Right.
And how like 10 happened. And Alice in Chains, who were probably the one band of that scene that didn't grow up in the punk rock scene with it.
Yeah.
They grew up in the adjacent glam metal scene.
Yes.
But like, they had a major label record. Soundgarden had a major label record. Both of them well before, like a couple of years before Nevermind.
Well, what's interesting about Soundgarden is when they signed, they were basically being marketed as a metal band because they didn't fit in with the alternative rock scene. That's for sure. There wasn't what became the heavier side of alternative, I guess. We saw them open for Danzig when Danzig was a big deal.
That's amazing. How do you remember that show? Do you remember the Danzig energy in that moment?
I didn't appreciate Danzig at the time. I was a big Misfits fan, but Danzig kind of left me cold. And, the stage setup was kind of big metal, demon thing on the stage and all that. And I thought it was silly. But in more recent years, I've come to appreciate Danzig as kind of a gateway to a lot of people into like underground music because they saw it on MTV when they were kids and got them going. So, and now I listen to it, I go like, that's actually pretty good.
It's funny how that often happens with stuff.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a little bit of the arrogance of youth wearing off.
Right. I try to go back and listen to shit that I hated back in the day or dismissed and see what I think of it now. And it's amazing how different my opinion of it is.
Any recent revelations or epiphanies?
Well, I just saw Mary Timony play a couple days ago.
Yeah.
So I've been listening to Helium and really enjoying it.
Great. Just a little rec for the listeners.
Steve and I were talking about like Spaceman 3 versus Loop like a couple weeks ago. And that was just like, Spaceman 3 was around first. And like the kind of like in fanzine world, like Loop was dismissed as like kind of fake Spaceman 3, but they fucking sounded great.
Yeah.
And, and at the time I was just kind of like, oh, they're fake Spaceman 3. And their records sound great, and they are heavier than Spaceman 3. They're, it's a different thing. And I kind of feel bad for getting caught up in that shit.
Well, it's always amazing. You're in a band, and I'm sure, you guys, more than a lot of bands, have gotten lumped into some categories that you probably have mixed feelings about. And then you catch yourself doing the same thing.
Doing the same thing, yeah. Stupid.
It's like liking a band's early stuff better, You're like, I hate it when someone comes up to me, it says that, but then I go to my record collection and lo and behold. So the record executives are in town. Do you remember what the attitude was like around them? Were they viewed as interlopers? Were they welcome bearers of, resources and money?
I think there was a healthy sense of skepticism, but also people were just willing to take the bait.
And, during this time, we didn't want to go to a major label. There was just a lot of chaos surrounding Sub Pop at the time. And that's what kind of spurred our decision to move on. But we were kind of late to that in a way. And I don't remember meeting record executives in Seattle proper. It was once we, sort of gave our permission for our manager to accept invites is when we started talking with them.
Right.
Yeah. I guess the first label person we spoke to was like Keith from Caroline Records, who was the Sub Pop distributor label. They had like Smashing Pumpkins at the time. And we actually went to dinner with him here in Seattle at the Pink Door, which still exists.
Yeah. I keep meaning to go back there.
When's your next record contract up? You should get in touch with Caroline and see if they still have the expense account.
I think we're chained to Sub Pop in perpetuity, whether they like it or not.
Did you finally get that stock that they allegedly offered you in lieu of money owing back in the day?
Well, I cashed it in. I just bought like Truth Social at its peak.
Buy high, sell low.
Yeah.
That's the rock and roll way. So what about Reprise Records attracted you particularly?
Well, kind of the history of the label, for one thing, like Reprise and Warner Brothers, like the greater Warner Brothers catalog, like a lot of stuff that we were into, that wasn't necessarily like super commercial. And just talking to them, their approach sort of seemed like kind of more hands off. Like I remember we talked about like our last record was recorded on 8-track, and was it Lenny Waronker? Steve was in like a lot of great records are recorded on 8-track.
Yeah, it was Lenny.
You know, we're like, we want to record in the same basement home studio that we did their last record at.
Yeah, and they were more relaxed about side projects, and that was a concern for me because I was in, you know, and Mark and I were in Monkey Wrench. I was in a couple other bands. You know, I had a record label just starting up, and they didn't care about that. Some of the other ones were more like, oh, that's something we'll have to talk about. You know, they just seemed more relaxed, and our A&R guy, David Katz-Nelson, was very young and very excited, and he had their ear because in 1991, 92, after that explosion, the major labels realized they didn't know what was going on. And so they brought in a lot of young music fans, essentially. And David Katz-Nelson was definitely one of those. You know, it seemed like a really good fit. You know, there were still some of the old time original reprise people still there. They left in the next few years, of course, but at the time, it seemed like the best fit to me anyway.
Yeah, we caught the last gasp of like artist-friendly major label, it seemed like.
Yeah.
We saw the last of like the Mo Austins, Lenny Waronkers, you know.
Yeah, Lenny's name has come up a few times while I've been doing this podcast, and he really seems like he was a true standard bearer for something that maybe isn't around anymore. I'm always really curious, how far along in writing the songs that ended up being on Piece of Cake were you when you realized that it was going to be a major label record?
I don't think we started till after we saw it.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So the reason I ask, of course, is that the thing that fascinates me about the presence of major labels, and also just the presence of the tantalizing possibility of, like, you know, more success, whether that's mainstream success, radio, video, whatever it looks like in whatever time. In my experience, it can be very tempting and very easy to sort of, you know, nudge the creative process slightly, not necessarily to become cynical like I think people imagine, but to just consider a little more, hey, how's this going to translate to the listeners out there? And I wonder if, while you were putting these songs together, if that was ever something that you guys talked about or thought about or were conscious of at all?
I think we were had come up through like the punk rock underground thing. We were very conscious of like trying to kind of cling on to our roots. You know, one of the things that we are concerns, the change in sound that like both the Replacements and Husker Du made when they signed to like Sire and Warner Brothers, you know, and they basically said like, you know, we just gave them the money and they did what they want, you know, so that I think reinforced our approach of like going back to Conrad Uno's studio in his house and recording that way. Like we may move labels, but we're going to try to approach things in a similar manner. Wrote total hit songs like Techno and
Untitled 3.
That's, you know, that stupid little thing that starts off the record.
I love that thing.
A lot of people didn't, apparently. We might have been overreacting a little bit, I think, you know, and putting that kind of silly stuff on there. And we might have maybe taken it a little bit more seriously, but we called it Piece of Cake because everything was easy for us. Yeah, Piece of Cake. That was kind of, you know, one of our things that we said a lot. And, you know, it's not our best record, I don't think, but it also has what I think is the penultimate Mudhoney song in Set You Dry.
The second last song?
The ultimate?
The quintessential?
So, I don't know. You know, it's just part of our history at this point. You know, we were learning as we were going, and we were young and arrogant, as I said.
Did you like working in the studio? Like, I read that they had upgraded from 8 to 16 tracks by the time you went in. Were you looking at that and rubbing your hands together, imagining all the great overdubs you were going to do?
Well, I mean, it gave us a little bit more breathing room. Like when we recorded Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, we had to think like, if there was a keyboard added, like I didn't play guitar or something like that.
Yeah.
Didn't we have to sometimes like do one track of some overdub while we were mixing?
Yeah. So, you know, like there's probably like a tambourine track or something that's only exists in the air.
Yeah.
It's not on tape anywhere.
Wow. Talk about a live off the floor performance. We're committing this thing to tape as you play the tambourine part on it. So don't cough.
Yeah. It was, I kind of like the discipline, I guess, of the 8-track. You know, I think that's part of the charm of Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge. But I know Conrad wanted to upgrade his studio, and, you know, this is the perfect chance for him because he was getting a bit of cash from the whole thing too. So, you know, it was better to have 16 tracks.
How have you adjusted since then? I mean, now I've recorded songs where there's like 211 tracks, you know, the Pro Tools session just infinitely continues. Have you guys?
Yeah, we try to keep that in check.
It's hard. It's hard. We can just add that little lick right there. It can be on its own track, its own tone.
I'm fine with whatever. I'm not any kind of purist, but I like the way recording has progressed. It's a little bit of everything, and it sounds a lot better than it did when it was recorded at DATs and stuff like that. You know, that was the low point, I think, when everything switched from tape to DATs. And, you know, I've got a drawer full of DATs that probably, mixes from my record label that probably don't work anymore.
That's digital audio tape for anyone listening who's not familiar with the DAT format. So back to the studio for a second. Were any of the label guys around? Did the A&R dude come in and hang or give suggestions even, or were they hands off?
Dave popped up for a little bit during My Brother the Cow.
Yeah.
And like the mixing of Tomorrow Hit Today happened in LA. So he was around for that for sure.
Yeah, it was pretty hands off, honestly. They let us do what we do, and we had it into tapes, and that was that.
And how did you feel about it when it was finished? You just said, you know, maybe not your best sounding record, but what was your vibe when you were listening to those mixes back for the first time?
Did we go down to LA for the mastering, Mark?
I did with Conrad.
Okay, you did. Okay.
I was high. That was not helpful at all.
Yeah.
That's how I function in mixing too.
Yeah, I try to stay out of the mixing for the most part, you know. At this point, I've learned to not sit there and get lost in every...
Yeah. It's better when it's not a fight of like, I need to hear more of me.
Yeah.
And I think that's like kind of what happens with young bands.
Totally.
You know?
Sure. And you've listened to it as parts for so long that it's really hard to listen to it as music again. You spend all your time...
As a whole, yeah. You're like, I'm doing this cool lick.
I remember a mixer once sort of saying, like, you guys are done with notes once we started debating over 1 decibel of tambourine level. He said, you guys are you're cut off.
Yeah.
It's finished.
Yeah, that was a long, slow learning process for me to stay away from the mixing. Yeah, I'll leave and come in for to hear what the engineer that we trust has come up with. And generally, I don't really have anything to add. I'm like, that sounds great. And, you know, maybe I'll go like, oh, I think I wanted my little bit there to be louder, but but the guys that we trust, I trust them.
It's a good way to operate.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the album art. I hope I say his last name right. Ed Fotheringham, who also, I think, sang with you guys in the Throwing Ups.
He did.
At one point.
Yeah, he's an old friend of ours. Mark lived with him.
Yeah.
What years did you live with Ed?
84 or 5, something like that.
Yeah.
Probably.
And I lived with him from 89 to 92. He's just always around. He was just part of the crew, if you will. And he was a very talented painter at the time, visual artist. And we started getting him to do art for us for Superfuzz Big Muff. He did the woodcut for the band name on the back cover.
Sick.
He was really into woodcut at that point. And then he got into drawing little stick figure things. And he did a t-shirt for us first, I think, the Trinkets and Baubles t-shirt. And, you know, he lived with me and Dan. So we got him to do the Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge thing. And after that, he kind of switched his career into being an illustrator. And for Piece of Cake, he did the illustrations and Art Chantry did the layout. And Art Chantry was another fellow traveler, artist, graphic designer that did he's done so much, but he might be best known for doing almost every single Estrus Records cover through the 90s.
Are you guys hands-on in the artwork process? Is that something that you take a lot of?
At that point, we kind of let Ed do what he did. He had some great ideas for Piece of Cake, and he was really inspired by this. Mark, do you remember the name of the...
Nathan Gluck. It was Art Chantry's idea to do this sort of Andy Warhol-esque thing. So he got Ed to do the illustrations and the sort of the style of like Andy Warhol's earlier commercial work. And he got person who did the lettering actually tracked him down, and he did the lettering on like all like the credits and stuff for Piece of Cake.
It was much more art historian than we were.
Yeah.
And yet still harmless.
Harmless, yes. Harmless art historian.
We have harmless historians in every discipline. The harmless podcast historian is going to be the next big wave, I think.
And I remember like at one point we like did a show with the Walking Seeds in Leeds. There were a band from there, and one of the guys obviously went to art school, and he's like, I love what you guys did with with the cover, like, I cannot believe you guys came up with that. That's, and I'm just like, I have no idea what he's talking about.
Smile and nod.
Yeah, we were. Yeah.
So Piece of Cake comes out, does pretty good. You make a couple more records on Reprise, and then you end up going back to Sub Pop. What took you on that journey?
Well, the next thing we did was an EP, $5 Bob's Mock Cooter Stew for Reprise. And I think that was a misstep historically. I think we should have waited and done a full length and used those songs and other things that we came up with. But it was kind of a rushed stopgap kind of thing. And we also shouldn't have called it $5 Bob's Mock Cooter Stew.
My band also ill-advisedly released an EP, and we called it Melancholy and the Infinite Radness, and then looked back and we're like, maybe we should have waited and made a record that had a less silly title. So I really sympathize. Anyway, and then back to Sub Pop. How did things end with Reprise? Not trying to dig up dirt here, but...
Well, it ended like any band that's not having a hit on a major label.
I don't feel like we didn't get screwed over. There's no horror story with our...
No. We didn't end up owing a shit ton of money or anything like that. In fact, like, the crazy thing was, like, once, like, in the early 2000s, I was trying to, like, figure out, like, what the hell our publishing, like, what's going on with that. And we kind of realized that, like, we thought we were registered at BMI. We weren't.
Uh-oh.
And, like, working with Polly Johnson Dickinson from 764 Hero in the Fantagraphics warehouse. And she hooked me with her, like, rep at ASCAP. And so kind of finally went back and, like, registered all those songs. But the bummer was that, like, the statute of limitations goes back 7 years. So, like, all the early stuff when the band was the most successful, like, all that publishing money was just somewhere else.
Oh my. So for the uninitiated, these are BMI, ASCAP, are bodies that function to direct royalty money to bands, basically.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that some of those big songs in, MTV days, radio days,
Yeah.
you didn't get the royalties from?
We got some royalties, obviously, but we didn't get publishing royalties.
Oh, those are the good ones.
Yeah.
Shit.
Oh, well.
But I mean, I think, like in the early days, Sub Pop was, and the bands on Sub Pop, none of us knew what we were doing. We were, like, trying to figure it out, and, like, they were pretending to be a record label and we were pretending to be a band. Eventually we all became what we are. They became a record label. We became a band, more or less.
So when you returned to Sub Pop, do you feel like at that point you had become a band and they had become a record label? Did it feel different that time?
Well, at that point, it kind of felt like we had been a band. It was like, are we going to be still a band? I don't know. Like, Matt had left us.
Yeah. Did you consider stopping then?
Well, when Matt left, and it was about the same time that we were being dropped by Reprise, we did what, still somewhat young men do. We just said, let's not talk about it for a year.
Communication issues in a band? Now I've heard everything.
But it made sense. Like we said, because Dan was gutted because Matt was his roommate and sidekick, for all those years. But let's just not even think about it for a while. Me and Mark went and did another Monkey Wrench record and had some fun doing that and doing a little bit of touring and stuff. Then both Reprise and Sub Pop wanted to do best ofs, and we managed to get those combined into one bigger best of because Warner's owned a non-controlling share of Sub Pop, and I was not working a regular day job, so I was kind of the point person with Sub Pop on it, and I was going down to Sub Pop all the time and dealing with them, and I'd liked the records they were putting out at that point, and they seemed to have a really great crew there, and it felt very natural to be hanging around at Sub Pop again. And when we got back together with Guy on bass, I think Dan talked to Jonathan Poneman and just said, will you put out our next record, or can we be on your label?
No, I think John said something to Dan, like, so when are you going to, like, do a record for Sub Pop or something like that? And Dan was like, really want one? We're like, what? Like, he was kind of surprised.
Yeah. It seemed like a very natural fit again, And
it seems to have really contributed to the longevity and the sustainability, for lack of a better term, for what you guys have been able to continue to do.
Well, it helps to have someone in your corner who's just, like, willing to put out your record. I mean, we've been so incredibly lucky to have this, like, long relationship with Sub Pop. And I know other bands that, like, struggle to, like, get their shit out. I don't feel like we've ever had to like tap dance for attention.
Yeah. Sometimes I envy us.
I envy you too. And the thing that I find really fascinating is, in the music industry, especially in those moments when everything is in the 90s, everything's, percolating up, you're kind of always one fluke away for having a Smells Like Teen Spirit or, whatever, a smash hit. Do you kind of feel lucky that Suck You Dry didn't move 20 million units? Do you think that if that had happened, it would have led you guys down a different path?
If Suck You Dry had become a hit and sold like 20 million or whatever, I think that would have been an amazing feat. And I could live with that. If we would have had to write a Runaway Train to get that same kind of reaction, I'm glad we didn't do that.
Yeah. I think we remained who we are throughout this whole thing, for better or worse. We all feel very lucky.
That's the beauty of the indie band as a sort of creative unit, is that, as you say, do what you do, and just as long as you keep doing it, you stay, which seems, when you're trying to be relevant or you're trying to, if you're chasing a hit, it can lead you off the path really quickly. And then if you don't get the hit, what do you have?
Yeah, there's nothing worse to me than like watching like a big band who's maybe like not as big as they once were, trying to capture something that is like currently in the mainstream. And, like by the time, I love David Bowie, but by the time he did like a jungle song, that train had sailed.
Had run away, as it were.
That train had run away.
Christian rock bands where they always seem like 2 or 3 years behind the times, They're doing ska when ska was dead.
It's never dead.
Ska is never dead. One takeaway from this interview, we're going to cut everything else and just boil it right down to that. Ska will never die. You heard it here first. So to wrap up, we like to ask bands what they were eating in the studio when they were making the record. Do you recollect the meals that were on tap when you guys were making Piece of Cake?
I've got one for this. Conrad Uno loved having corn chips and cottage cheese. And when I go to the studio still, I go buy cottage cheese. I never buy cottage cheese any other time unless we're in the studio.
Mark, would you partake of the corn chips and cottage cheese? The CC and CC?
Of course. But when Steve's not looking, otherwise he's really selfish about it.
I guard it like I'm in prison.
Sometimes he has to go to the bathroom, though, and I can get like sneak in a couple of bites. I do remember when we did Piece of Cake that we went to, there was a local pizza chain called Round Table Pizza. And like Charles actually took photos of us, but there was a group of LARPers there sitting at like this square table.
And Charles took a picture of me standing next to a stuffed like pelican or some bird. Yeah. And I going through all the old pictures and stuff. I think I used that in my book. I'm just looking at myself going like, I look fucking filthy.
Yeah, it wasn't a really good, like we weren't styled very well that day. I think I was wearing like a long sleeve striped shirt with like a oversized Daydream Nation t-shirt all over the top of it. Just maybe a baseball hat, which I don't normally wear a baseball hat.
It's always tough getting photographed in a hat. People think you're a hat guy.
Yeah.
You only want to be known as a hat guy if you've just chosen that life.
Yes.
Well, I think that is a harmless history of Piece of Cake and Mudhoney and rock and roll and, America. Why don't we just say it? So, Mark, Steve, thank you so much for joining us, and congrats both on Piece of Cake, which is a kick-ass record. I really enjoyed listening to it a shit ton preparing for this. And also, as I said at the beginning, I can't congratulate you enough for just like sticking it out. It's the dream. I hope it feels good.
All right, man.
Awesome. It was fun going over this.
Mark Arm and Steve Turner of Mudhoney. I don't know if Mudhoney has endured because those guys have their heads screwed on right, or if they've acquired that wisdom via the band enduring, but either way, I'm impressed. It is no mean feat to spend 4+ decades making rock and roll on indie labels and major labels through all the transformations in the music industry and still come out the other end sounding like normal human beings. There's this specific way that older record label guys like to talk. I learned about this when Tokyo Police Club was talking to major labels back in the day. These guys will tell you a story about, it's always some little band who nobody believed in, but who beat the odds to make it big. And then at the end of the story, they wrap up by being like, that band was called Metallica. and it's a big dramatic reveal. And putting together the intro of this episode where I was, telling the history of Mudhoney felt a lot like telling that kind of story. Because everything that happens is like, then they got together with a little local label called Sub Pop Records. And when things are that iconic, that like narratively complete and perfect, I think that in a way it sometimes lets us not listen to the music. Like we think we know what the band is about. We think we know the context and the sound, and the information gets in the way of what the music sounds like. But Mudhoney were never characters in a VH1 documentary. They were, and they still are, a living, breathing band, like 4 guys making artistic decisions, chasing whatever creative inspiration compels them. And so if you haven't spent time with their music recently, the songs, the records, the recordings, not the story or their narrative role, I really hope that this episode gives you a reason to get back in there and check it out. Because aside from being incredibly influential, yes, and important, it's just great shit. And speaking of great shit, it was great shit talking to Mark and Steve about Piece of Cake, and it does my heart good to know that they're out there right now still rocking. So thanks to them for the great talk. Steve's book, Mud Ride, A Messy Trip Through the Grunge Explosion, is available from bookstores everywhere and is well worth a read. And of course, Piece of Cake and the entire Mudhoney discography right up through 2023's Plastic Eternity all continues to slam. Major Label Debut is produced by Josh Hook and John Paul Bullock, and our theme music is by Greg Alsop. We have merch for sale on our website, majorlabeldebut.com. I must, of course, ask you to subscribe and rate and follow the podcast and all our various social media accounts, where you can also drop us a line if you have any requests for Major Label Debuts that you think we should discuss. So thank you very much for listening. Major Label Debut will be back with more tales from the intersection of art and commerce.